The story begins not with a scream in the night, nor with the flashing lights of police cars, but with an eerie quiet that stretched across two different eras of American crime. Two killers, two methods, 2 decades apart, and yet bound by the same chilling truth. Evil can hide in plain sight. In Sacramento in the late 1970s, a handsome, broad-shouldered man named Gerald Armond Gallego walked through bars and nightclubs with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed him something. He held the arm of a young woman who looked out of place next to him, soft-spoken, timid, her eyes carrying the weight of someone learning too late that they had tied their life to a human storm. Her name was Charlene Williams, and together, they would become a murderous duo whose cruelty would shock investigators for generations. Charlene came from an educated, upper-middle-class home. She played piano, excelled academically, and had the kind of upbringing that gave everyone the impression she would one day become a respectable professional. What no one could have predicted was that she would fall into the orbit of a man who saw women not as people, but as toys he could break whenever he wished. Gerald had already been drifting in and out of trouble long before Charlene met him. He had fathered children he never cared for, manipulated partners, and used intimidation to get what he wanted. But beneath the roughness, he had a magnetism that drew Charlene in. He could be charming, funny, and attentive when he needed to be. Other times, darkness poured out of him in waves. The transformation of Charlene began slowly. It always does. First, she changed how she dressed, wearing what Gerald liked. She stopped talking to friends who didn't respect him. Her parents noticed the shift and tried to intervene, but Charlene defended Gerald with a loyalty that only deepened the more he controlled her. Soon, she was no longer the girl she had been. She was the extension of Gerald's will, and his will was twisted. Gerald had fantasies, violent ones. He wanted young girls, teenagers, sometimes younger, and he didn't want to simply watch them. He wanted to capture them, dominate them, and do things so depraved that even hardened detectives would later struggle to speak about them. Charlene should have run. She should have screamed. But instead, she helped. Whether out of fear, obsession, or a desperate desire to keep Gerald's love, she became the bait. That was how it started on September 11, 1978. Two girls, both teenagers, left a shopping mall in Sacramento. They had spent the afternoon buying clothes, gossiping, and planning their futures, ordinary dreams of ordinary girls. They didn't notice the couple watching them from inside a beat-up Dodge van. Charlene stepped out first, soft voice, friendly smile. "Hey, do you girls need a ride?" They hesitated. Charlene looked harmless. The kind older sister every girl feels safe with. The van door slid open. Inside waited Gerald. What happened next would later be described by investigators as one of the most horrific abduction cases in California's history. For hours, the van became a torture chamber on wheels. Gerald assaulted the girls repeatedly while Charlene drove to a secluded area. No one heard the screams. No one saw the terror. When Gerald was done, he took the girls into the woods. Only the rustle of leaves witnessed what happened next. 2 gunshots echoed through the trees. Charlene looked away, but she didn't run. She didn't stop him. She simply stood by as Gerald wiped the gun and told her to get back in the van. The murders gave Gerald a taste of power he had never felt before. And like many killers, that taste turned into hunger. Over the next 2 years, they would repeat this pattern again and again. Shopping malls, parking lots, quiet streets. Charlene lured, Gerald destroyed. They crossed state lines, moving from California to Nevada to Oregon, searching for new victims. Each time, Gerald's violence grew. Each time, Charlene's conscience shrank. But this story does not belong to one monster alone. On the opposite side of California, in a neighborhood miles from Sacramento's nightmares, another predator lurked, one who would remain hidden far longer, protected by silence, neglect, and the chaos of the crack epidemic. His name was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., but Los Angeles would remember him by a different name, the Grim Sleeper. Franklin didn't storm into the lives of his victims like Gerald did with brute intimidation. His method was slower, quieter, built on familiarity, and the ability to blend into the shadows of a community struggling to survive. He fixed cars. He traded small favors for goodwill. He laughed with neighbors and offered rides to women who needed help. In a neighborhood often ignored by authorities, Franklin looked like a man who belonged, stable, friendly, the kind of person who waved at children playing in the street. But behind the closed doors of his home, another truth rotted. Police would eventually link him to at least 10 murders, possibly dozens more, stretching from 1984 to 2007. His victims were mostly vulnerable women, many struggling with addiction or homelessness during one of the most turbulent eras in Los Angeles history. To Franklin, they were invisible, easy to approach, easy to overpower, easy to dispose of. His weapon of choice was usually a handgun. His signature was cold efficiency. Unlike the Gallegos' chaotic brutality, Franklin was methodical. He left his victims in alleyways, dumpsters, or abandoned lots, discarded as though their lives meant nothing. But at the time these crimes began, no one connected the dots. Police departments overwhelmed by violence, communities torn apart by drugs, missing women reported late or not at all. Franklin relied on that. He counted on indifference, and for decades he was right. Back in Sacramento, Gerald and Charlene were preparing for yet another hunt. But something was changing in Charlene. The nightmares were tightening their grip. She drank more. Her nerves frayed. She argued with Gerald, something she had rarely done before. The violence was eating her alive, but she couldn't break free. Gerald knew it, so he tightened his hold. For some killers, control over their accomplice becomes as intoxicating as control over their victims. In June 1980, they abducted 2 young women from Reno. They were students, bright and full of life, on their way to a party. Charlene watched as Gerald violated them inside a forest clearing. This time he didn't shoot them. He used a hammer. The brutality shocked even Charlene. She vomited afterward, but Gerald only laughed. He told her to clean herself up and get back in the van. It was another line crossed, another piece of Charlene's humanity shattered. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles south, in the streets of Los Angeles, the grim sleeper had begun to evolve. At first, he targeted women living on the margins, believing that society's neglect created a protective cloak for his crimes. But eventually, he began keeping souvenirs, photographs. When detectives would later search his home, they would find nearly 900 images of women, many unidentified, their fates unknown. The photos were trophies, or warnings, or both. Each image was a whisper of a life he might have stolen, a haunting question mark that lingered long after his arrest. 2 killers, 2 timelines, 2 nightmares unfolding in the same state, but in entirely different worlds. Gerald and Charlene were spiraling fast, leaving chaos and evidence behind them. Franklin, however, moved like a ghost. The public barely knew he existed. But justice has a strange way of catching up. On November 17, 1980, Gerald and Charlene abducted a couple from a shopping center in Sacramento. This time there was a witness, a license plate, a description. Detectives began piecing together the pattern. A van, a couple, abductions linked across multiple states. Charlene panicked. She begged Gerald to stop, but he couldn't. He wouldn't. The trap closed on them in Reno. Charlene, terrified and exhausted, finally cracked under pressure. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, she made a choice that would define her legacy. She agreed to testify against Gerald. Some called it survival. Others called it betrayal. The families of the victims called it too little, too late. As the Gallego case made national headlines, Lonnie Franklin remained invisible. His murders continued quietly, hidden beneath the noise of gang violence and drug war hysteria. But eventually, even he slipped, and a single, small mistake would bring 3 decades of murders to light. But that was still years away. For now, 2 eras of horror continued to unfold, one ending in a courtroom filled with reporters, the other still prowling unnoticed through the back alleys of Los Angeles. The story of these killers is not just about the brutality they inflicted. It is also about the systemic failures that let them thrive. Victims dismissed, neighborhoods ignored, warning signs overlooked, and predators who learn to exploit every crack in the system. And yet, despite the decades and the distance between them, all roads were slowly leading toward the same truth. Even killers who believe they are invisible eventually leave footprints, and eventually, someone begins to follow them. The courtroom in Sacramento buzzed with tension as Charlene entered, her hands trembling despite the calm expression she tried to maintain. Cameras flashed like bursts of lightning, capturing the face of a woman who had lured victims to their deaths. Families of the murdered sat silently, their eyes burning with grief and fury. Gerald Gallego, sitting across the room in a crisp suit that didn't match the animal beneath it, stared at Charlene with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. For someone so accustomed to control, betrayal was the one act he couldn't tolerate. Charlene's deal with prosecutors had changed everything. She would testify against Gerald in exchange for a drastically reduced sentence. She wouldn't face the death penalty. She wouldn't even spend the rest of her life behind bars. To some observers, she was a victim manipulated by a violent man. To others, she was equally monstrous, a willing participant who traded lives for her freedom. But the law demanded her testimony, and the families demanded answers. As she took the stand, her voice wavered when she described the first abduction. She explained how Gerald planned everything, his fantasies, his rules, the way he chose victims for their youth and vulnerability. She spoke of the van, the ropes, the secluded forest locations. She described how Gerald demanded obedience, how he punished her if she hesitated, how he fed off fear like it was oxygen. Her words painted a portrait of a sadistic predator who enjoyed domination more than anything else. And yet, as she spoke, the courtroom couldn't ignore the fact that she had been in that van every time. She had held open the doors. She had watched. She had helped. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, in neighborhoods miles away and years apart from the Gallego trial, women continued disappearing. The bodies left behind bore the same haunting pattern: gunshot wounds, signs of assault, and the chilling similarity in how they were discarded. Detectives working the case had theories but no breakthroughs. The victims, families begged for answers, but with limited evidence and overwhelming caseloads, investigators could do little more than document and move on. Lonnie Franklin watched this unfold from the sidelines, a quiet predator hiding behind a smile. He continued fixing cars, hosting neighborhood cookouts, and maintaining the facade of normalcy. To most people, he was a helpful, reliable man who knew everyone on the block. He gave rides. He offered repairs. He joked with kids. In a community too often overlooked by the city's leadership, Franklin's presence was comforting. No one suspected that he was hunting among them. Back in Sacramento, prosecutors presented their evidence: photos of the victims, maps of where bodies were found, forensic details that made jurors visibly recoil. But the most damning testimony came from someone who had survived, a young woman who had narrowly escaped an attempted abduction. She described a couple working together. The woman seemed nice at first. The man had dead eyes. That was enough to solidify the prosecution's argument. Gerald didn't just kill. He used Charlene as bait. During cross-examination, Gerald's attorney tried to paint Charlene as the true mastermind. He argued that she acted out her own twisted fantasies and blamed Gerald only to save herself. But Charlene remained composed. The scars of her involvement were evident, and despite the hatred directed at her, she continued to detail everything: Gerald's rages, his demands, the nights spent driving through parking lots searching for victims. The trial became one of the most talked-about cases of its time. Reporters described it as a descent into pure evil, and investigators, hardened by years on the job, admitted privately that it was among the worst they had ever seen. Every time Charlene spoke, Gerald glared at her, his jaw tightening. He seemed more furious at her betrayal than at the accusations. The jury took little time to convict him. He was sentenced to death in California, and later in Nevada, he received another death sentence. Gerald Gallego would spend the rest of his life behind bars, leaving behind a trail of shattered families and unanswered questions about how such violence could go unchecked for so long. Charlene, on the other hand, served her reduced sentence, and eventually walked free. Some believed she rebuilt her life somewhere far from the headlines, living quietly, trying to erase her past. Others insisted that someone like her could never truly escape the weight of what she had done. But while the Gallego case closed, a different darkness continued quietly in Los Angeles. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Lonnie Franklin kept killing. But then suddenly the murders stopped. Detectives would later call this the sleep period, the gap of more than a decade in which no cases matching his pattern emerged. It was during this time that he earned the nickname the Grim Sleeper, though no one knew who he was. Some believed he was dead. Others thought he had been imprisoned, moved away, or simply lost the urge to kill. But the truth was far stranger. Franklin hadn't stopped killing because he feared getting caught. He hadn't had a moral revelation. The pause in his crimes appeared to be tied to his job. He had been working with a city sanitation program, collecting discarded items, moving through alleys and neighborhoods unseen. It was the perfect cover for someone who wanted to abduct vulnerable women. But when his employment changed, his access changed too. For years, the killings appeared to halt, but in reality, they had only shifted. Some victims weren't found, others weren't identified. A few deaths were never connected to him. The true number of those he killed will likely never be known. Then in the early 2000s, the murders started again. Same methods, same areas, same signature. It was as if the Grim Sleeper had awakened, and with terrifying precision, he resumed his hunt. This time, however, DNA technology had advanced. The world had changed, and mistakes that once slipped through the cracks now left a trail. Investigators began comparing DNA samples from old cases to new ones and noticed something extraordinary. A consistent match was showing up, not to a suspect, but to a relative of one. This was the first major break in decades. The DNA belonged to Franklin's son, who had been arrested on an unrelated charge. The likelihood that a close relative of his was connected to multiple murders was overwhelming. Detectives built a case around this lead, and they moved cautiously. They needed direct evidence, a sample from Franklin himself. But Franklin was careful. The detectives were more determined. They followed him, watched him, studied his routines. And then, one day at a pizza restaurant, Franklin finished his meal and threw out his utensils and plate. He didn't know that detectives were waiting. They retrieved the discarded items, rushed them to a lab, and held their breath. The match was undeniable. After more than 25 years of confusion, frustration, and heartbreak for families of the missing, the Grim Sleeper had a name: Lonnie Franklin Jr. When police finally entered his home, what they found stunned even the most seasoned detectives. Hundreds of photos lined his walls and drawers, women posing, smiling, unaware that they were being cataloged by a killer. Some of them were alive at the time the photos were taken, but many were not. Investigators believed that the images hinted at far more victims than the official count. Each photograph was a chilling reminder of how invisible many of his victims had been to the outside world. The search also revealed something else: a hidden compartment. Inside were items taken from victims, trophies, jewelry, clothing, pieces of their lives that he kept as souvenirs of his power. The collection was so extensive that detectives realized the true horror. The number of women he encountered, manipulated, or possibly killed was far greater than what had been reported. The news sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. Women who had lived in the affected neighborhoods came forward with stories of strange encounters with Franklin, rides offered, money exchanged, moments that felt wrong but were dismissed at the time. Families of missing women demanded answers. Some recognized the faces in the photos. Others recognized the jewelry or clothing. It was the beginning of a massive effort to identify the unknown. While Franklin's arrest dominated headlines, a retired detective followed every update on the case with a heavy heart. He had worked the original murders in the 1980s. He had walked through alleyways where bodies were found, spoken to families who begged him to keep looking, and fought for resources that never came. Now, decades later, he finally had a name, a face, a man to put at the center of the puzzle that had tormented him for so long. As Franklin awaited trial, he portrayed himself as calm, almost bored. He denied everything. His defense team argued that the crimes were a product of the era, that evidence had been contaminated, that the chain of custody was flawed. But the DNA was too strong. The photographs were too many. The testimonies were too detailed. Survivors came forward, describing encounters with a man who matched Franklin perfectly. One woman described escaping from his car, running barefoot through the streets until she found help. She had never known his name. Now she did. In Sacramento, older detectives remembered the Gallego case and saw the parallels. Two predators hiding in plain sight. Two sets of victims ignored or underestimated by a society that didn't protect them. For years, both killers had thrived because no one looked close enough, or long enough, or with the urgency their victims deserved. The grim sleeper trial stretched on, filled with emotional testimony and painful memories. Families held up photographs of daughters, sisters, mothers who had vanished years earlier. They demanded justice not only for their loved ones, but for the countless unidentified women whose images were found in Franklin's home. The prosecution laid out a timeline so detailed and so disturbing that even court staff struggled to maintain composure. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom erupted in sobs. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found guilty on 10 counts of murder. Later, he was sentenced to death. Even then, some families felt only partial closure, because the truth was clear to everyone. 10 was only the number the court could prove. The real total would likely remain a mystery forever. But at least, finally, the killing had stopped. Years passed, but the consequences of the Gallego-Williams crimes and the grim sleeper murders remained etched into the communities they had terrorized. In Sacramento, detectives who had long since retired still carried the burden of the cases, remembering details they wished they could forget. Families of the victims gathered at vigils year after year, lighting candles, sharing memories, trying to bring light into the darkness that had consumed the lives of the young people taken from them. For the parents of the 2 teenagers kidnapped from the mall in 1978, time did not heal the wound. Time only deepened it. They had lived through a trial, through media coverage, through public outrage. But no amount of justice could restore the futures their daughters never had. Charlene Williams had faded into anonymity after her release, living somewhere far from California, far from the headlines that once printed her name in bold letters. Some people claimed she lived under an assumed identity. Others insisted that she had remarried, had children, tried to build a normal existence. But normal was a word that would never truly belong to her. Even in freedom, she carried the unbearable truth that she had helped bring about the suffering of so many families. Every quiet moment must have been a reminder of the screams she could not erase, the faces she could not forget. Gerald Gallego, on the other hand, died in prison years later, his heart failing long before the state could carry out his sentence. Some saw it as an injustice, that nature had taken him too gently, too quickly. Others saw it as a small mercy, sparing the taxpayers from the long, slow climb through appeals that so often delayed the death penalty. But the echoes of their crimes were still heard. Each new generation of detectives studied the Gallego case as a lesson in manipulation, coercion, and human depravity. Future psychologists analyzed Charlene's role, trying to understand how a woman raised in comfort and privilege could become complicit in horror. Some argued she was a product of Gerald's control, beaten down emotionally until she could no longer think for herself. Others believed she made choices, terrible, unforgivable choices. In crime textbooks, she was neither entirely victim nor entirely villain. She was a gray area, a warning to anyone who believed they were immune to influence or incapable of becoming part of something monstrous. In Lowe's Angels, the fallout from Franklin's crimes was even more complex. The community around South Central had long lived with the sense that their pain was invisible to the rest of the city. Women had gone missing for decades, their cases dismissed as runaways or addicts. Families had been turned away, told to wait, told to be patient, told their concerns were low priority. Those wounds reopened when the grim sleeper trial revealed how many opportunities had been missed, how many lives might have been saved if someone, anyone, had looked deeper. The mistrust between law enforcement and residents, already strained, was pulled even tighter. But there was also resilience. Advocacy groups emerged made up of families of the murdered, determined to keep the spotlight on missing women. They held marches, created community patrols, and demanded better systems for investigating disappearances. Their work led to reforms in how missing person cases were handled, especially those involving vulnerable women. They refused to let their loved ones become statistics. They refused to let the grim sleeper's legacy be nothing more than a trail of grief. One detective, now retired, kept a box of case files in his garage, a violation of protocol technically, but no one had the heart to demand he return them. He kept them because he had promised a mother decades earlier that he would never forget her daughter. He kept them because he had once walked into an alleyway and seen a pair of shoes lying beside a dumpster, and the image had burned into his mind so deeply that he could still see it whenever he closed his eyes. He kept them because he knew that even though Lonnie Franklin had been convicted, there were still women out there, women in the photos, women no one had identified, women who might not even have been reported missing. He knew that justice was incomplete. Sometimes, late at night, he would open the box and flip through the images, not as a detective but as a guardian of stories that would otherwise disappear. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that remembering the victims was a form of justice too. In a world where predators thrived on invisibility, memory became a weapon. Forensic investigators, newer to the profession, took on the task of identifying the hundreds of women found in Franklin's photo trove. Some had been tracked down alive. They remembered Franklin as a man who offered them rides or asked them to pose for pictures. Others were confirmed deceased, their cold cases reopened with fresh eyes. The identification work continued for years after the trial, a slow, painstaking process that brought closure to some families and fresh pain to others. The stories of the victims began to emerge, piece by piece, giving names and lives to those who had once been dismissed. Some were mothers, some were daughters, some were women trying to escape cycles of addiction, some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their humanity, once overshadowed by the brutality of their deaths, was reclaimed by people determined to honor them properly. Meanwhile, journalists continued to draw comparisons between the Gallego duo and the Grim Sleeper, not because their crimes were alike, but because their cases highlighted the failures and blind spots in criminal investigations. In both stories, killers exploited vulnerabilities in society. Gerald relied on Charlene to lure victims. Franklin relied on a community too neglected to receive the attention it deserved. And in both cases, the killers used the same camouflage: normalcy. Gerald looked like a confident man out with his girlfriend. Franklin looked like a helpful neighbor with a toolbox. Evil rarely appears with a warning label. It appears with a smile, with small talk, with the illusion of safety. Their stories became cautionary tales of how predators often hide in plain sight, relying on the trust or inattention of the people around them. Years after Franklin's conviction, a young woman living in the same neighborhood he once stalked discovered an old newspaper article about the case. She read it from beginning to end, horrified not only by the crimes but by the number of victims who had been forgotten. She made a decision that day: she would become a social worker, dedicating her life to helping women struggling with addiction and homelessness. The Grim Sleeper's shadow reached places he never intended, inspiring healing instead of harm. Her work became one of many ripples of change that spread from the tragedy. But there was another story too, quieter and less talked about. One of the survivors of a Franklin attack, who had managed to escape decades earlier, found herself struggling with the renewed attention. Every news broadcast, every documentary, every headline reopened wounds she had spent years trying to heal. She had lived her life in the aftermath of trauma, often in silence, only speaking publicly when detectives needed her help. Now, with Franklin behind bars, she faced the complex task of reclaiming her story. For her, survival wasn't a single moment of escape. It was every morning she woke up and decided to keep going. Her strength, often overlooked in the broader narrative, became a powerful reminder that victims are more than what was done to them. They are what they choose to become afterward. In Sacramento, another form of healing took shape. A memorial garden was built in honor of the victims of violent crime, including those killed by Gerald and Charlene. Flowers grew in places where families once felt only despair. In the garden, plaques listed the names of victims, their ages, and dates of death, allowing future generations to remember the lives that were stolen. It wasn't justice in the legal sense, but it was a reaffirmation of life, a space for grief, a space for peace. In Los Angeles, new protocols were introduced for cold cases. Detectives received additional training. DNA databases expanded. Community partnerships strengthened. The legacy of the Grim Sleeper became a blueprint for how not to let history repeat itself. While nothing could erase the suffering caused by Franklin's crimes, the changes brought a sense of purpose to those who had spent years demanding answers. They had fought for their daughters, sisters, and mothers, and in doing so, they had changed the system for the better. Yet no matter how many reforms emerged, the stories of the victims remained the heart of the narrative. Their memories lingered in the minds of family members, neighbors, and the rare people who dedicate their lives to seeking justice long after the world moves on. The victims were more than footnotes in criminal history. They were dreams interrupted, futures stolen, lives that deserved better. One evening, the retired detective from the Sacramento case visited the memorial garden. He walked slowly, reading each name, stopping at the ones he remembered most vividly. A breeze carried the scent of the flowers, softening the harsh memories he had carried for decades. He knew he had done his best. He also knew he would always wonder if he could have done more. In Los Angeles, a community organizer held a meeting in a small church. Families gathered, sharing updates on cases still open, still unresolved. They passed around photographs, told stories, and comforted one another. A mural on the wall showed the faces of W.